hyperlink being sent to you all now. And it's really wonderful to see such a high level of interest in this topic. Before we get started, just a very quick point on logistics. This is a recorded webinar style event, but we really want to encourage active participation in the discussion portion of the program. So if you wish to ask a question or make a point to the panel, you can indicate that you'd like to speak in the chat box, which should be a function that you can access. We will then add you as a participant while you speak. You can also just pose a question in written form at any time, and my colleague Aditi and I will do our best to channel questions to the panel as we go along. We were meant to have the Deputy Permanent Representative of the Government of the Netherlands to open this up. I think that we're having a connection problem, but I'd just like to start by thanking the Government of the Netherlands for generously supporting this work. The Netherlands has been a really strong proponent and a leader within the Action for Peacekeeping initiative, which this project is designed to support. And really one of the most common phrases in the UN that we noticed is that peace operations should seek political solutions, that they should be based on the primacy of the political. But we noticed that there was very little understanding of what political meant in practice and how different missions have interpreted their political mandates and developed strategies towards political objectives. And I personally remember being a political advisor in the UN mission in the Congo. And when I was asked to develop a politically driven strategy for an armed group, I remember thinking, I wonder what they want here. And this project is really meant to give substance to that term political, to help us understand from the experiences of peace operations and from some of the leaders in and around the UN system, what it means to design and implement a political strategy for a peace operation. For the remainder of this event, our panel of extremely well-versed speakers will discuss different aspects of this question, from the challenges of mandating peace operations to the various ways missions have developed their own strategies, to some of the dilemmas that confront the UN when peacekeepers must use force to protect civilians and engage politically at the same time. We have a really impressive panel for this discussion today with decades of experience in peace operations, in senior government positions, and leadership within international organizations. And I'd like to really thank Tori, Amira, Karen, and Patrick for joining us today. And we'll introduce you one by one as we go through. Without any contact from the Deputy Permanent Representative, we may come back to him, Mark Zellenrath. We're going to move to our first panelist and get right into it. Our first panelist is wearing more than one hat today. Tori Holt is not only the Vice President at the Stimson Center, a well-known expert on peacekeeping, and a co-author of our report today, but she was a senior official in the US government under a previous administration and has a unique perspective on how peacekeeping is supported. Today, she's offered to speak to the joint Stimson UN University findings in our report and highlighting some of the most important of the points, giving some of her own thoughts on how they can influence peace operations going forward. Tori, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Adam. I very much appreciate this collaboration between the Stimson Center and UN University and the CPR in New York. It's one of the most important issues in peace operations is understanding the political solutions that go alongside. I also want to join your thanks to the Government of the Netherlands for their support for this project and their work on behalf of A4P. So I thought I'd hit some key points. This study really does try and advance a conversation on political solutions in several ways. We make an attempt at a definition, which we hope will kick off a useful conversation. We look at political strategies in very complex contexts, try to map the planning process, and also consider recent conflict trends, which are impacting missions today. And we also try and look at a very practical process of how political strategies emerge, what the roles of the Security Council, the Secretariat, host nations, and how those work together and how they could be improved upon. As Adam mentioned, this research was conducted including in-depth case studies. We had 5 looking at the UN missions, the largest UN missions today in South Sudan, Darfur, Congo, Mali, and the Central African Republic. Those case studies were authored by Adam Day, Aditi Guru, and Charles Hunt. The work was pretty in-depth, but we also want to acknowledge up front that we had some gaps. And one is that we primarily looked at the 5 large missions, and there is a lot more room to look at smaller UN missions, observer missions, as well as special political missions. We tackled part of this during a workshop this summer with very senior leaders and experts to try and tap into their experience and knowledge, which was quite lively, and we were very, very grateful for it. And that complemented our work. And we also think that today's conversation is an opportunity to learn and go forward. And we're aware of some areas that could use future research and understanding. All right, so let me now go over 5 or 6 major things about what we did learn and kick this off to the panel. First, and perhaps obvious, but maybe not always useful to say out loud, but in this case it is, the strategy must feed mandates, not the other way around. There's often an impression that once the council writes the mandate, then it kicks off political strategy. And I think it's pretty obvious, and we recommend that the HIPPO recommendation for a 2-stage process be considered. First, to scope out the issues and build a more well-informed vision of the eventual mandate for mission and understand the political strategy that needs to run alongside and include the operation, the work of the peace operation. So mandates should be informed by strategy and embrace and support them. But second, while political solutions are critical as a basis for a mission, the role of peace agreements is varied, and that role actually plays many roles. So in some senses, political strategy does not begin and end with a peace agreement. Many of you diplomats, those who've worked in the field know this. There are several instances in which a mission was able to carve out a meaningful role, even when there was a lack of a comprehensive peace agreement. So political solutions continue. Second, sometimes actually a partial peace agreement or a poor peace agreement could actually inhibit the long-term political peace and the strategy that goes along with that. And then obviously a point many of us know well, that not all peace agreements stop the killing, and that those at the table who are inking their names and signatures may actually either not be fully sincere or may not be able to control all the elements of violence, and that peace agreements in the future have to be accompanied by political strategies to address that. So given the limits, what's a third area of our findings? We found that there's a lot of good strategies in the field that are being conducted, and it's worth case studies and taking a look to understand them. I'll hit a few. But first, better analysis of the conflict dynamics at a cross-cutting level to include stakeholders, regional and local actors, and the political economy can often be much more in-depth understanding of how the local feeds the strategic. This can also support better strategic communications and strategies for it. It can also touch in the area of peace dividends, which are also often anticipated by those who are in and around peace operations, but may not be explicit enough to be articulated. And then finally, some of the case studies really did find that work at the local level and with local disagreements and efforts for mediation could feed into the larger political piece and the solutions for the mission. So fourth, we found that the size is not always relevant directly to the strength of the political strategy of the mission. Indeed, many of us have talked about this for years. The larger the mandate gets, sometimes the less influence it may have, because it seems to often even be replacing some of the functions of government or institutions in a country. So political strategies are really key, but they may not relate to the level of force and the mandate strength. Tied to this also, and this is an area we know needs better attention, is how the protection of civilians, which has increasingly become a mandate element for most of these large missions, be better tied to political strategies and the interplay between the two. We think there's a lot of evidence that that can happen and can be better. Fifth, a reoccurring theme is host nations and weak governments. Both provide real challenges if they're not fully bought into the political agreements, and how to prioritize and strengthen the mission's ability to deal with them across a range of issues is very important, and how those activities can be based on maybe even supporting better host state consent. This has elements of the Brahimi report in it, an area that many understand, and also an area of better attention for how to strengthen the leadership of a mission's ability to get diplomatic support when a host nation is either weak or non-cooperative or not actually in support of the peace agreement. And then finally, one size does not fit all. We know this. When we had our discussion with political leaders, it ranged from the political strategy is in the SRSG's head to it was deeply documented and signed off by everybody in the mission. There is a space in between where missions should understand the political strategy across the mission components, but so should the population, those who are supporting the peace operation, the host nation and others. So how to be better and more directly have the strategy better articulated and understood so that, in a sense, marching orders can come out and people in the mission can be understanding how their activities tie to the political solution. Finally, just a few thoughts from me. I know from my own time in government that much of the debate before a mission was about the political strategy. That's often behind the scenes, not explicit, and it can unravel even after a mission is deployed. So I think we've all really come to appreciate how important that is, that political alignment is to support a mission. And I would also, again, quote the Brahimi report, not only should governments be at the table and the parties to conflict, but the UN should be at the table prior to and during any design that affects the way the mission operates. I also want to point out part of the report addresses conflict trends, and many of us are keenly aware of the changes in the Security Council, how the pandemic has affected conflict, how the increase in violence against civilians has really changed the nature of some of the conflicts that peace operations have to deal with, as well as non-state actors in some proxy wars. So I think this is a time where the politics and the political strategies and the political solutions really matter. So I think this report should kick off a good conversation about it. Again, I want to join Adam in welcoming our speakers and the panel discussion. So over to you, Adam. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tori, and thanks very much for walking us through some of the main findings, but certainly not the only findings in our report. So please do have a look at it. And I realize that we now have well over 100 participants, so just to welcome those who came in during the speaking, and to reiterate that if you do have questions or points you'd like to make, feel free to start putting them in to the Q&A box at any time. And if you'd like to speak, please indicate that also. We'll get to you after the panel. I'd now like to turn to Karen Landgren, who's currently the Executive Director of the Security Council report. And Karen has served as the SRSG of 3 UN peace operations in Liberia, Burundi, and Nepal, and continues to be a leader in shaping discussions around peacekeeping within the Council and in our New York ecosystem today. We're very lucky to have her today. Thank you so much for joining us, Karen. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Adam, and thank you, UNU. Really my warm appreciation to all the authors of this very interesting report. The report is especially illuminating on how the changing nature of conflict affects the UN's peacekeeping role and on the confrontational dynamics in the Security Council. My organization's Security Council report has written about better mandating that touches on the primacy of politics. So I invite you to have a look at our publications on peace operations. This UNU report has many cautions about how there is no one size that fits all and a strategy needing to be flexible and iterative and so on. So I want to draw on some of your observations to touch on 4 challenges that stood out to me. The first is the divided Security Council. The paper says these divisions have rendered the Council largely irrelevant to many of today's most serious conflicts. It also says mission strategies should take Council unity into account. I assume you mean Council disunity as well. It points out that Council members have authorized peacekeeping in areas of sudden or protracted conflict with fewer assurances that the presence of a mission will lead to a comprehensive or sustainable peace. I would ask you, is this a setting that lends itself to more frank and explicit discussion of political strategies? Certainly not openly. With Council members not being frank about their own bilateral political strategies, which may not be in line with UN or Council decisions or with international law for that matter, is it even productive to talk about clearer conceptualization via written documents of mission political strategies? I want to quote a Secretariat colleague I spoke to recently who said, "The problem is not the tools, the problem is the lack of trust." With all respect to Lakhdar Brahimi, the sorts of honest discussions one would wish to have as the basis of strategy may not be possible in the Council. It would be good, however, if they could still happen within the UN Secretariat. And I think when Tori refers to the space in between where strategy is articulated, that is a place to concentrate more than council secretariat leadership discussions. Second challenge related to this, in order to have a strong analytical basis for a mission strategy, which is one of the recommendations, take that task outside the UN more often than is currently done. The DPO response to missions' inadequate uptake of the 2014 mission concept guidance, judging from your paper, seems to be, let's have new guidance, only this time with a bigger role for headquarters. Both parts of that response seem flawed. The spirit of HIPPO is to derive more analysis from the ground, and the SG's reforms are also about placing decisions closer to the field. If that's not happening, a more interesting formula is the independent strategic review with red teaming, not a review that gets rewritten under pressure from member states. Last year's DRC review by a team under Youssef Mahmoud is an interesting example. And the SG's cover letter in circulating that review says that it contains a useful re-examination of key assumptions underlying the mission's military mandate and its mandate to protect civilians. And indeed, it does. It also challenges the mission's fragmented approach, including to protection, with no strategy for the state to fulfill its role. It's quite a mission-centric strategy, according to this review. Do we have evidence that the Council was persuaded by this review, especially the recommendations around the Force Intervention Brigade? Did the Secretariat put its full weight behind this review's recommendations? So even a quality strategic review is going to have its limits. Those limits are particularly acute, I would suggest, moving to the third challenge. The third challenge to clearer political articulation right now is the dominance of the military components. It's easy to overlook just how dominant the uniformed personnel become in a peacekeeping mission. To some, they represent the main added value of the peacekeeping mission. This report refers to the readiness of the Council to deploy peacekeepers into settings without viable peace processes, and often during large-scale conflict, which it describes as a trend, and a trend that leads to prioritizing physical POC and even neutralization of armed groups. In a piece on the primacy of politics I wrote for IPI 2 years ago, I quoted someone from the leadership of the Mali mission saying that the mission had not been paying enough attention to the politics. And the great quote in this UNU report from a former senior UN official referring to South Sudan is, "We used up all our political juice on operational things." Now, just imagine if the more extreme recommendations of the Cruz report were adopted. Surely the use of overwhelming force by peacekeepers would further obscure a mission's fundamental political orientation. Uniformed components have been allowed to dominate peacekeeping mission life and thinking, and perhaps member states want this. The 2019 strategic review of the DRC that I mentioned refers to the continued, quote, relentless push for militarized responses. So that has to be addressed and tackled. Now I want to end on a happier note. Fourth and last, which is the importance of political economy that this report brings out. The authors note how many conflicts at the local, national, and regional levels are driven by economic factors. Some peace operations have taken creative steps, ranging from disrupting local rackets to engaging with banks and finance ministries, but many UN stakeholders are reluctant to acknowledge this issue and the roles mission can play. Peace operations should not only analyze the political economy, but think creatively about how to engage with it. That's a quote from today's report. Inequality can be a fundamental driver of war. The Liberian Nobel laureate Lema Bowie once told me that one thing that will keep Liberia stable is better basic services. Some of the most important measures taken or proposed in stabilization have been around fairer, more inclusive, more transparent financial management. An ordinary Liberian once told me that the form of transitional justice he wanted was a road to the market. My great fear for Liberia is the continued failure to address the elite capture of the economy. So, two takeaways here. Perhaps COVID is leading the way to greater Security Council acknowledgement of searing inequality as a factor in peace and security. Second, it's critically important for subsequent mission transition that the economic and social issues are analyzed at the beginning and are factored into the strategy at the beginning, so that they are already contextualized in the political strategy, because these are the issues that give many agencies, funds, and programs their clear role in supporting the overall vision for a more stable country. So this is where I see a real opening up to something important and with huge potential in this report. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Karen. And just to mention that Yosef Mahmoud is actually in the audience, so your points about his strategic review and how it was received, we may get word from the actual author of the report later on, but thank you for that point. And also on the points you made about the dominance of the use of force, we're really lucky that that Patrick Kamert will be speaking a little bit about that, but I'm very interested to hear also if there are DPO colleagues in the audience who might want to speak about some of the challenges around use of force. And your final point about the political economy, that is really such an interesting one, and I think you built well beyond our report in some respects, and I hope that we can circle back to that. I'd like to now give the floor to Amira Haque, who served as the SRSG of the UN mission in East Timor, and also as the Undersecretary General in the Secretariat on the Department of Field Support in New York. She was also the co-chair of the UN's high-level independent panel on peace operations, the famous HIPPO report, which has been one of the most important efforts to reform peace operations in the past 20 years. And again, just to welcome you, Amira, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today.
Thank you, Adam. And I'm very happy to be here, and thank UNU and Stimson for very stimulating report. I understand that Ian Martin is in the audience, and he was also on the HIPPO panel. And so I just want to shout out to Ian that please feel free to chip in or during the comments when it's open for comments in terms of other thinking behind those of us on the HIPPO panel. So I'm really, I was really taken aback by this, when we wrote the HIPPO report and talked about the primacy of politics, we never really sort of interrogated it. And I'm very happy that this report is putting so much emphasis in terms of what exactly is this? I mean, you're talking about what exactly is it? And I think we really need to get our thinking around it. I know you had a discussion group around this, and I think it's something that will keep sort of redefining itself, because as I think in the report you mentioned, politics is something, it's elusive, sometimes it's opaque, it takes various forms and methods and mutations, all kinds of things. So it's very difficult to encapsulate it and define it, sort of around a set of parameters. So I think this will always be kind of an iterative process of definition. But from a very practical point of view, as we're talking about establishing mission mandates, and then we're talking about a secretariat's role in standing up a mission, it has to have some definitions in order to enable the practice. And so we've got to, put these definitions into the planning of the mission, how the mission is configured, what kind of people are we going to find for these missions that have those commensurate skills of what we want to achieve. How are we going to get the proper guidance from headquarters and our, the backstopping offices, and of course, even in the absence of unity of Security Council, but there has to be some element of, the support and assurances coming from the Security Council to go forward as the mission reports to the council in its periodic reviews. So I'm going to touch on 5 topics here based on how we try and get this right, and it will repeat some of what has been said. But Tori, you talked about the improving mandating by the council, and that it seems to come from the top down. And we were very conscious of this in the HIPAA report. And when we had our regional consultations, I think some of the concerns, expressions, sometimes even, sort of cry from the heart, was you've got to be listening to people on the ground. And these were, very strong civil society groups, women's groups, but many other stakeholders as well. So it has to come not from hurried assessments and briefings, but these are the things that are going to get anchored into mission mandates. So one of the things we talked about was this 2-step mission, and again I'll call on Ian to speak about his experience from Libya, but that is at least in our way of thinking, was kind of the most sort of sensible approach, although it extends the time. And I think what people sometimes are impatient about, and the Security Council and member states and even the Secretariat, impatient about, get it on the ground fast. But if you unleash $1 billion mission on the ground so fast and haven't taken, whatever 3, 4, 5 months that it takes to understand this, the deep knowledge of the setting, as was quoted in the report, I think we're making a very, very big mistake in the interest of more timely and quick deployments. So I think putting a team together to get to be on the ground would really, the feedback from that and the analysis that comes from there, and talking to stakeholders, the regional players, looking at the inherent balances in the country. What are the underlying drivers of conflict? All of that coming together, I think would put the full weight of all of this knowledge from the ground behind a mission. And I think it is much easier, and particularly if you can have someone who's going to be the SRSG already, but if you have some of the people from the senior mission leadership, and I think that goes a long way in internalizing what the mission mandate is across all the people in the mission. So I think, I continue to emphasize that this kind of 2-step approach is in my opinion, a very important thing. I also want to, I think no discussion of peace operations can happen without one reference to Christmas tree mandates. These challenges of the large multi-dimensional missions. And I've been in the one in Darfur, where I was the humanitarian coordinator as well, and so saw the perspectives not only from sort of the mission perspective, but also from actually dealing with people who had been displaced, who needed protection and who needed life-saving support at that time. So the pragmatic challenges are that, with a huge mission like this, and where you had, the host government putting blocks at every possible turn in the mission deployment, or denying access to areas where we knew that civilians and the civilian population were in harm's way, were kind of those overtook us in the mission. Those were the problems that we were seized with on a day-to-day basis. What's happening in Kalma camp? What's happening in Zalinji? All of this. So that the mission, in terms of these challenges, and some of it are logistical, operational, but also, related to the provision of humanitarian assistance and food. I don't know how many times I went to urge that WFP, food be released from the docks and all of that. So those kinds of logistics of these huge missions do, I think, in a way, detract and take away from this political strategy. And I think we need to really understand what, in the end, it lends, and SGs then and the senior leadership sometimes don't have the time or the leverage to keep the focus on politics. The next issue is the local peace processes. Again, has been touched, but very often, and again, I refer to my experience in Darfur on this. At a national level, peace and even the discussions and trying to get, all the parties to the conflict around the table were elusive. I mean, it was difficult. We had 3 missions sort of simultaneously within the theater in Sudan. On the other hand, there was work that was being done by country teams and by the local mission staff in the deep field. And Karen, I was going to mention that one of the things that we looked at, for example, was the access to markets for some of the communities, and bringing 2, sets of, parties together to enable the access to markets and trying to make it a win-win kind of situation. So sometimes these opportunities exist at the local level, where the national level opportunities just are being pushed aside. We can't get to the table at the national level. But on the other hand, there's a lot that can be done at the local level. So whether it's the work of the looking at the needs of the pastoralists, and I see Ellen is also on in the audience, and I'm sure she can tell us about local initiatives at the in South Sudan. But the other thing I also want to say is that the governments do not have any presence in these deep field locations where the UN is present. And so the UN, whether it's, and I've seen it, the civil affairs officer, the human rights officer, the governance officer, they take on a role which, in a sense, if you magnified it, would actually be the envy of the SRSGs and others in the national level who are trying to achieve some kind of negotiated settlement around local issues. So I think that emphasis on the local peace processes is very important. Karen, again, my 4th comment was that many SRSGs or leaderships tend to dismiss peace dividends, kind of what you referred to with respect to the political economy. And there, I think economic factors, the lack of local, the lack of addressing issues of justice that go to the core of people in their daily life. there are very often here tensions between the military and the civilian group, because particularly I know that in Congo, it was like, well, here's the military going and stabilizing an area. Development workers, where are you? You know, what's happening? How are you going to stabilize them? And I felt that one of the things that I struggled with, and I guess people still do today, is trying to explain that development doesn't happen in that same instant way. And you know, this coordination and the ability of what the country teams can do, and the lack of resources and funding for country teams, but the whole integrated strategy doesn't really happen. And you know, there is a lot that can be done. And just you know, I happen to be on the board of an NGO right now, and I'm really amazed that they were telling me about post-Ebola in terms of discussing post-COVID scenarios. And I was amazed at how quickly microfinance, those who had access to microfinance, how quickly in the aftermath of an Ebola crisis, microfinance got stood up in many countries in West Africa. And that to me was amazing. So I think there are opportunities for these kinds of, you know, peace dividends to happen. And lastly, I think that, you know, I have to talk about exit strategies and transition, which wasn't, by the way, a part of the report. And I think it's a very important element that you ought to address. And it is that, you know, we have to, from the very beginning, we must ground and formulate and define a peace mission in a way that is going to render it obsolete. That has to be the conversation from the very beginning. And this will avoid creating patterns of dependency and, more important, sidelining national partners. And I want to leave my part of this on emphasizing this, that planning for transition, political solutions, building capacity, local peace dividends, all rest on our ability to recognize that it is national authorities in the end who must be empowered, trained, nurtured, you know, met with, you know, brought into the discussion, the inclusivity that we're seeking, these negotiated settlements that we're seeking, you know, that the emphasis on that kind of building up and shoring up these national capacities are absolutely critical. Thank you.
Thank you, Amira. That was so many good points. I won't try and summarize them all, but just to point out, when you mentioned the importance of perspectives from the field, we have wonderful people in the audience who can speak to that. And you mentioned Alan Loy. We've also got Kenny Gluck and Jack Christofides who can give us really interesting perspectives. And I want to just take this opportunity to say, for those of you who may have joined a bit late, you can put questions in the chat box at any time. You can also indicate in the chat box that you'd like to speak or ask a question in person, and my colleague James will add you so that you can speak after our final speaker. So please do start. We've got a couple questions coming in now, but please do make your points and questions in the chat box so that we can move quickly into discussion fairly soon. But just a couple points that I'd love to see more discussion on from Amira's is the role of development and how that and issues like microfinance, how those could actually be concretely included in a strategy. And a very good point you make about exit strategies and transitions. We do cover it a bit in some of the case studies, but you're absolutely right. It's something we should discuss more. And so lots to talk about there. I would like now to turn to Major General Patrick Kamert, a retired Dutch general who served as the general officer commanding MONUC in Eastern Congo. He was also the former force commander for UNMI in Ethiopia, Eritrea, and served as the military advisor to the UN in New York. And as you heard, one of the findings that Tori mentioned was the challenges of combining force with politics and with political strategies. And we're really lucky to have Patrick here today because he's done so much of that in his career. And we really look forward to hearing from you, Patrick. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Stimson Center and UN University Center for inviting me to this panel. I would like to compliment you on this excellent, interesting paper. You asked me to comment on the challenges of developing a political strategy that included how the use of force would play a role in delivering the outcome. And you would be interested in my experience on how force and politics can work together. Let me say from the outset that I would like to underline that I'm here talking about peacekeeping and not peace enforcing. And the word Force Intervention Brigade has already been mentioned. And in my view, and I wrote it in IPI paper in 2013, FRB, the Force Intervention Brigade, and the word overwhelming force is, in my view, over the edge of peacekeeping and is influencing the impartiality. I would like to concentrate on peacekeeping. The United Nations is not to destroy the enemy, is not to destroy armed forces or the opponent, and then when the enemy gives up, we sign a ceasefire or peace agreement, etc. We are talking about a UN force that is meant to stop the immediate killing and violence and push the warring factions or parties back to the negotiating table to join the political process again. All the missions where the United Nations are deployed to cannot be solved by military means, but only by finding a political solution. And that political solution means for me that it is the center of gravity of a peace operation for all mission components, including the military. We call it also the primacy of political. I liked in the paper Jean Arnaud's definition of the term politics, stating simply the search for negotiated solutions to conflicts. Let me react to the definition of political strategy. This report focuses on the translation from a council mandate to a mission strategy. It uses the term strategy broadly, given the range of documents that might constitute the strategy within the UN system. It states, and I quote, "Today's peacekeeping missions are required to have a mission concept, a document that should provide strategic guidance on the basis of the council mandate," I quote. The word "today's peacekeeping missions" triggered some memory of my time as the military advisor in DPKO at the time and the general officer commanding the Eastern Division in Monuc. And let me share some of my experience. I served as the military advisor of DPKO from 2003 to 2005. And my military division was responsible for drafting the military concept of operations to support the political frameworks of DPKO. In 2004, after the Bukavu crisis, a strategic review was undertaken by the Undersecretary General Jean-Marie Guéhenno himself. A mandate was formulated, a mission concept drafted at UN headquarters with political framework hooks, as I call them, given by our political colleagues in the Africa Division. On those political hooks, the military division put our military concept of operations on, all in close consultation with the mission, and the police did the same. Then this integrated mission concept, formulated at UN headquarters, including the political, military, and police guidance, went to the mission Monuc. In the meantime, I had moved from New York headquarters to Monuc as division commander. So this mission concept from UN headquarters was translated by Monuc headquarters in a mission plan, where I wrote as the division commander my campaign plan for the East. And every sector commander then translated the campaign plan into a sector concept of operations, but always as a red line with the political objectives in mind. In preparing for this panel, I searched for my campaign plan, forming the Eastern Division in 2005, 15 years ago, in line with the guidance from UN headquarters, New York, and MONUC mission headquarters. And I give you a few quotes. In order to support the political effort, the administrator in Ituri and the preparation for the elections, DDR and restoring state authority to the government, we, the military, have to ensure a safe environment so that the political and humanitarian colleagues could do their job. Another one, since the beginning of February 2005, MONUC is heavily engaged in combat operations against Ituri armed groups and armed elements in the Kivus. This will continue for quite some time since the hardcore leaders of the Ituri armed groups still cause serious problems. MONUC conduct more mobile, higher tempo operations than ever before. Such operations demand day and night employment of all the assets. These types of operations, including the use of special forces, are the start of a new chapter in peacekeeping operations. The result is that certain UN regulations should be adjusted in order to carry out those operations. This was in 2005, 15 years ago. With these quotes from the campaign plan that was developed as a result of political and military direction for UN headquarters, through mission headquarters to me as division commanders, I hope I described how this flow was, in my view and experience, very clear, and authority was clearly delegated. Interestingly, this Stimson report mentions that there is a new draft guidance in development by the Department of Peace Operations, which should shift the responsibility to develop the mission concept from missions to the Secretariat, also requiring that mission concepts develop a broad political direction to guide its mandate implementation. I must confess, when I read this, you can imagine it gave me a kind of deja vu feeling. Finally, I'd like to mention in this context a few challenges. The first is the military senior leadership in missions sometimes do not understand the integration of the effort to implement the mandate. They're working in isolation, not understanding what political primacy means. Jean-Marie Guéhenno argued, and I quote, that larger missions sometimes fail to use their presence as a fulcrum for gaining influence in country due to a lack of understanding of the political nature of peacekeeping, as if the conduct of military operations and the military posture could be divorced from the politics of the situation, unquote. Unfortunately, in several missions, we observe that the SRSG and the force commander are not hand in glove, something they should in order to be successful. Force and politics can work together, but it should start at the top. Second point is that the report stated that peace processes are typically considered top-down elite bargains initiated by the conflict parties and eventually trickling down into improved stability for the broader citizenry. In my experience in MONUC, the military component tried as much as possible to support the heads of office and civil society with their bottom-up approach, realizing that national politics are deeply connected to local dynamics. The same I witnessed when I did investigation in certain incidents in Juba and Malacca in 2016, and in UNMISS in South Sudan in general. UNMISS 2018 strategy demanded that activities like intercommunal conflict resolution, local work to promote justice, and engagement with traditional authorities should all clearly demonstrate how such work would feed into the revitalized peace process at the national level. The third point is community engagement. Community engagement is key to success of the mission implementation of the mandate. It's not something only for civilians, and it is very much also a task for the military and the police, linked to the bottom-up approach that I just mentioned. Finally, UN peacekeeping is more frequently confronted with an environment of no peace to keep, Where belligerents have not fully laid down arms, peace agreements are either incomplete or lapsed, and or the more traditional functions of peacekeeping are less relevant. That requires a different way of thinking, changing the composition of the force in the various missions according to the threat and operations. But peacekeeping is not war fighting. What does not change is that the military component and its leaders should understand that the military component is part of the mission, as are the police and civilian components, all working to support the political objective. All these challenges are not new, but we have to do something about them now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patrick. And it's really great to have a perspective from someone that's actually had to deal with the use of force alongside a mission strategy, which is a really important perspective. And your points about force being aligned with mission strategies, I think in your experience, you've managed to do that. And in some of our case studies, we really saw that that wasn't always the case, but it's absolutely a really interesting and important point. And also your point about national politics being deeply aligned with local dynamics is something that other speakers have mentioned, but really getting into that is a difficult question that hopefully we can discuss. We've got some questions coming in on the Q&A. And we also have Ellen Loy, who I think is being added now as a participant, who is going to make some points. Ellen is the former SRSG of UNMISS in South Sudan, and was also a member of our expert roundtable earlier on in this project. And I see now she's just been added. And we'd love to kick off the discussion with you, Ellen. Thank you so much for joining, and great to see you again. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. I just a few remarks picking up on the panelists. Thank you to Tori, Karen, Amira, and Patrick. I basically agree with everything you have said. I'm particularly happy, if I may say so, that Patrick's remarks about the understanding of senior mission leadership, what it is to work in an integrated mission. As you said, I have been in South Sudan and I was 4 years in Liberia. I think the biggest challenge you have as a member of the senior mission leadership team is to get it to work together, and to get it to everybody, every member, to understand that we are there in order to achieve a common goal. And the force is a challenge, but sometimes I have to admit, sometimes the civilians are also a challenge in understanding they cannot command the force to do everything, but to get us all to work towards the same goal. And there I totally agree with Amira. And I have said it to my staff so often. People in a peacekeeping mission, be they in uniform or civilian, are not there to earn a monthly income. They are there to make themselves superfluous. So we have to work towards some common goal. And in order to do so, that was another point that Amir brought up, we have to work with the UN country team and the humanitarian actors from the outset. It takes, people are saying, up to 30 years, at least 20, to build a functioning legal sector. So the mission cannot run around and try and think that they can do that if they are not cooperating with those in the UN country team who is going to finish the work on part of the UN and the international community. And I really think these 3 points are very, very often forgotten. Amira and I have been involved in senior mission leadership training, but I think I have really, I have good experience, but I also have very bad experience as to how it was next to impossible to get the senior mission leadership to pull towards the common goal. And if there was something that annoyed me tremendously, and now there are 100 people listening, so I won't mention any names, was that when members of the SML during our meetings were sitting there on the cell phones and not participating, listening, and ensuring that we worked together and understood what we were doing. That, I think, was a challenge in Liberia and certainly in South Sudan. I think I will stop here because I think these 3 points are not so much in the report, but I want to congratulate you on the report. I tried to run through it very quickly. I think there are some very, very important points in it. So congratulations on that.
Thank you so much, Ellen. That was really fascinating. And it's always great to have the anecdotes from your time as well. That really adds a lot of depth to what you have to say. We now have Yusuf Mahmoud, who, as one of the earlier speakers noted, apart from many of his other jobs, including former SRSG, wrote the most recent strategic review for MONUSCO in Congo, and I think that was a point that was drawn on earlier. But please, Yusuf, if you have any reactions or responses, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you for all the colleagues that have preceded me, and thank you for the excellent report. I like very much all the points made by Karen, Amira, Victoria, and my friend Kamer. Just 3 quick points. The first one is linked to the Hippo report, of which I was a panel member. I think the discussion about the primacy of politics should be read in connection with our comments in the report about stabilization and counterterrorism. And at that time, we were following very closely, as Amira knows, the development in Mali and the progress of the mission establishment, where we felt that there is a tendency to legitimize the use of force in the pursuit of an elusive peace. And we were, therefore, we had to say a couple of things on that. So I won't say more. The report, or the HIP report, is explicit on that. The second point is about politics. We did not really expand a lot in the report about what we meant by politics. But one area we discussed on the margins, but not really included in the report, is how to deal with power and politics. And particularly with the Security Council, we felt, and this is linked to the third point about leadership, that the Security Council mandate should not be viewed as the ceiling, but rather a floor, as a starting point. Because the realities on the ground changes. And unless you have the right leadership to interpret the Security Council as one parameter, not the parameter, then you don't have the right leadership on the ground. And I agree with the comments made by my friend Ellen. We both were at those training workshops, and it requires more than just training. And so listening humbly, continually to the voices of those on the ground, and accept with a humility that they have something to share about the direction of the politics. And I think the ongoing action by the SRSG and the DRC, for those of you who follow, and I do because of the report that was mentioned, she is truly exercising leadership, political leadership for peace, not simply political leadership for containment. And that's something that is, I think, behooves us to reflect on. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Yusuf. That idea of this council mandate being a floor rather than a ceiling, I wonder if Karen or others may have thoughts on that in due course. We do have maybe a couple more questions that have come in, and I'll start with Marco Donati, who we were trying to add as a participant, but it doesn't seem to be working. I'll just read it out. Marco, who is the head of civil affairs in New York, asks, isn't there a challenge to coherent political strategies for PKOs also because heads of missions are not in the driving seat in any of the national political processes? The focus then becomes squaring the circle dictated by council mandates instead of developing a political strategy with any other key stakeholders. And certainly in the case studies that I looked at and worked on, I mean, I did the Darfur case study, and Aditi may have something to say about the CAR, the Mali ones. The mission was not only not in the driving seat for the national political process, but was overtly marginalized during it. And one of the difficult things in the UNAMID context was how to identify moments where the UN could play a constructive role and where the peace operation could, despite a very low level of consent. And one of the innovations that I think we found around creating a strategy was in certain moments, and actually I think I see Daniela Kroslak in the audience, she may be able to speak to this. In certain moments, the use of the Secretariat and the African Union together in laying out what the political goals of the Darfur peace process were, was actually, the momentum swung back to the Secretariat a bit and away from the mission, which was really mired in difficult kind of dynamics with the government. And there were some moments in the Darfur timeline where they were able to articulate a clear and quite powerful political set of objectives. So it's interesting also to think about the center of gravity of political strategies in those moments. And Aditi, did you want to say anything about any of your case studies? Well, I think we're going to try and queue up Hector Brown, who has another question. But while we do that, maybe you want to say something, Aditi?
Sure thing. I'll just make a quick comment. As you mentioned, I looked at the case studies in CAR and Mali. And I think one thing that really came through in our expert roundtable as well is really the importance of the Security Council stepping in and being active in situations where the peacekeeping mission isn't in the lead on the political process or on the peace agreement. I think this also links to the comments that were made earlier about host state consent. You know, what do you do when you don't have a willing or a consistently willing host state government? And again, those are situations when we really need a very active participation from the Security Council. I found the Mali case study really interesting because it was an example of a situation where, you know, MINUSMA was not in the lead of the political process. Algeria played a much stronger role in the political process than originally anticipated. MINUSMA stepped back and kind of allowed that to happen. And there were indeed some positive aspects of that. It can be advantageous in some situations for the mission not to be in the political lead. But I think it's also an interesting example where the Security Council is very active, very supportive of MINUSMA. Lots of Security Council visits the mission, lots of attention from the Council on the mission. And yet at the same time, there were these key moments when the mission might have wished the Security Council to exert more pressure on the government or on other parties to the political process. And then the council seemed to step back. Again, in part, you know, because there were specific members of the council. France had a very clear interest of its own that was distinct from the broader Security Council's interest in MINUSMA. Where, you know, it speaks to the need for a really united and really active participation from the Security Council to make up for that lack of you know, having the peacekeeping mission in the lead on the political front. I'll just leave it there.
Thanks, Aditi. And this should be teasers for you all to read Aditi's case studies, which are really excellent. And she had great access to the leaders in both Mali and CAR. Hector Brown had a question, and I think we've now added him. Hector, would you mind just telling us where you're calling from, who you are, and your question? Thanks so much for joining.
Sure. Hi, Adam. This is actually Jesse Bernstein, and I work with Hector. A number of us were signed in as under Hector's link or name. So
Gotcha.
Sorry for there was no secret ploy behind that. I was really curious to ask about kind of political will, and I'm in particular thinking about the situation in ABIE and UNISFA, and I think the idea of a political strategy is great on paper, but if the parties to a conflict don't have the will, then what would a strategy do? And how do you action a strategy in that context, especially when this peacekeeping mission just rolls on? So I think I'd be interested to hear the panel's response on that aspect in particular, and how you kind of action a political strategy when there's just absolutely very little, highly limited will to actually resolve a political dispute, yet the peacekeeping mission is filling the void. And I should say, I work at the Department of State in the Peacekeeping Office. Thank you.
Thanks, Jesse, and all of Hector's other friends logged on. I mean, I think we actually do have Daniela Kroslak here, who I think may actually be the author of the ABIE mandate. And so, Daniela, if you're on and you want to join, just let us know. But I think ABIE is a great example of how difficult it is to have a political strategy with a mandate that is very much focused on containment and that only really has troops on the ground, and it's a kind of frozen process. I think one of the things that we found is when you can't solve something locally, I think this was in Charlie Hunt's case study actually, if you can't solve something at that local level, look for other fora to address and find points of pressure. And I think for ABIE, clearly the fora for pressure are beyond that small territory in between those countries. The difficulties we found is that often when you're trying to collaborate and coordinate with regional actors, especially something like the African Union, it can be very difficult to tee up a perfectly aligned approach. And certainly in the Darfur case study, that was difficult. Also in the South Sudan case study, where the members of IGAD took very different positions on the South Sudanese peace process, it was extremely difficult to say, okay, here's the UN's kind of approach. And one of the other things that also happens in some of these settings is you have many different UN actors. So in South Sudan, for example, you've got an envoy that's not based in country, you've got an SRSG, you've got a huge number of people in the Secretariat, and they all may have different slices of it. And one of the things we found is if you can identify the right player for the right role, you can gain leverage, even if the player in the mission may not have leverage at that moment. And there were moments in the South Sudan peace process where having someone outside who wasn't actively protecting civilians from the government, to be honest, someone who was less bound up in the POC sites, might have had more access on the political process, might have had more leverage. If I had an answer to ABIE, I wouldn't have the job I have now. But certainly that frozen one, if anyone has any thoughts on how to unfreeze it, we do have Daniela happy to take a stab. She's going to just be added. James, if you could add her as a participant. While we're adding Daniela, I think Karen Landgren was going to make a point on some of the Security Council dynamics, and Daniela will come to you in just 1 second.
Sure, 2 quick points. I really wanted to come back to a point that Patrick Kamert and Ellen Loy made about the military components and their integration with the political strategy. You may remember a couple of years ago, Alexandra Novoselov, who I think is also on this webinar, wrote a piece called Back to Basics, kind of suggesting paring down of mandating, as I recall. And one of her comments was that the UN lacks a mechanism to translate political strategy into military objectives. Now, I do tend to disagree with that, because that mechanism should lie in the relationship between the SRSG and the force commander. But I think it's really important that investment in that relationship varies. And I think that investment hasn't been prioritized. And surprisingly, this is not one of the issues that the Cruz report even mentions as an important element in how these two stay tethered together or fail to stay tethered together. And second, quickly, I very much agree with this notion of the mandate as a floor rather than as a ceiling. If we look at some of the Security Council's current difficulties in adopting mandates, and I would point you to what happened with UNAMA, although that's an SPM last year. That was resolved. It was resolved by cutting the mandate down from about 12 pages to 3.5, and we haven't heard cries of pain from UNAMA that they no longer know what to do. So I think we are really at a less is more moment in terms of what we should expect the Security Council or encourage the Security Council to say. All that is necessary is that the SRSG feels that they can work with what they have. And at the moment, less is more is probably the way to go with mission mandates. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. And those of you who follow Richard Gowan will have maybe seen his articles talking about the less is more likely direction of peacekeeping. And I wanted to mention also, even though this is a peacekeeping focused project, because it's under Action for Peacekeeping, we're aware that there are a huge number of lessons that can be drawn from SPMs and from special envoys, and we have tried to do that, but that would be, I wish the Dutch DPR was on right now, that would be maybe another project that would require a different line of funding. But I wanted to let Daniela Kroslak, who is just going to be coming on without video because of her internet connection, but she was instrumental in the ABIE process and wanted to say something. Go ahead, Daniela. I think none of us can hear her, am I right? Okay. Daniela, I think your connection, and I think you may be calling from the peripheries of Yemen somewhere, is not working. If you want to jot something down in the Q&A, I'm really sorry we weren't able to get you on the line. And then I think we were gonna, Tori, you had a couple points you wanted to make, and then James will add Ankit Bhuptani to ask a question after Tori. Go ahead, Tori.
Thanks, Adam. I don't have an answer on ABIE, but I can note that when I was in the US government, we passed that mandate with the assumption that it would be basically a 6 to 12 month enterprise. And it was meant to support an ongoing political conversation and negotiations. And because of the disputed area, we were looking to kind of put a hold temporarily on it, deal with some other things. And then there was never any thought at the time that it would ever get so frozen. That doesn't solve the current problem. But I think it's a really important case to bring up, because we can sometimes forget that the origins of a mandate were never meant to be the whole way forward. And you could actually argue the same thing with South Sudan. When that mandate in early 2014 was updated, it was also meant to be temporary and not a political strategy. And that was an overt consideration at the moment. So yes, further ways to think about how we transition from short-term mandates into longer-term ones. Do we allow peacekeeping missions to operate without a political strategy being overt from the beginning? If it's understood in the council and by the members, but not overt on paper, how does that disadvantage the mission? So I kind of had also a question back, because we have so many senior leaders here and also are the other panelists. I appreciate the comment also that Karen picked up about, is the Security Council mandate a start for political strategy, and what Youssef had mentioned, but also to pick up on what Amira has suggested about, from the beginning, peacekeeping missions should really be thinking about their exit strategy and becoming redundant. And I don't know if there's more we could say there on the political strategy for that. My colleague Aditi actually has thought a lot about how you think about preventing a return to conflict as part of your political strategy, not just ticking the box on tasks like hold elections or make sure you disarm so many people. So Adam, in a sense, I'm opening back up for conversation. I think Patrick may have views on this as well, because some of the tactical work that you do with the military is meant to be in support of the larger political strategy. So what does an end state look like? How do you build that into a assumption of mission leadership in the beginning? And then while I'm at it, I also observed many times that mission leaders were sort of wished well, but then had to use their informal networks to get political support when, say, the host nation started putting up roadblocks, or the peace negotiations went wobbly, or freedom of movement was closed down, and there was no automatic way to garner the political attention to those items short of a major Security Council meeting, which actually could backfire. So I'm also curious to our panelists, you've all been in the field, if there's certain tools you feel that could be strengthened so that leaders can do more of what they have. So thanks, Adam.
Thanks, Tori. And we're going to come to Ankit and Oliver one second. But that point about short-term mandates, I remember looking at the South Sudan mandate in 2000, anticipated that the job of SSR wouldn't need to be in the mission mandate 3 years after it started, which is just a kind of amazing thought to have when you look at South Sudan now. But Ankit, please, thank you so much for joining.
Namaste everybody, this is Ankit Bhuptani from Mumbai, India. This is the first time I'm attending this call, and so I do not know as much as all of you would be having an experience in the area. But one question which came to my mind while I was listening to the guest speakers here is that is there a way in which we can address the questions of cross-border terrorism using political peacekeeping mechanism with the United Nations? Because we in India have faced a lot of cross-border terrorism, and many other countries in the world also face the same issues. Is there a way we can address this concern using the UN mechanism under peacekeeping? Thank you.
Thanks, Ankit. I mean, we may be able to get into some of that question in very specific ways. I mean, Aditi wrote a case study looking at MINUSMA, which has a mandate that is kind of bound up in some of the member states' counterterrorism issues. I would say in the cases we looked at, there were very few opportunities for missions to do much in a cross-border way, period. And it's one of the real limitations of peace operations is they tend to have a national mandate, or even a subnational one if you look at Darfur. One of the things we've looked at in other studies is how the UN can do cross-border programming. But I think that's more of a tool of resident coordinators and non-peacekeeping missions, although there may be plenty of examples. I see Oliver's going to be speaking next. But Aditi, did you want to say anything about the Mali experience before we go to Oliver?
Let's jump to Oliver and we can come back.
Okay. Please, Oliver, the floor is yours.
Just unmuting myself. Thank you, Adam, and really, really nice to see so many old colleagues and friends and some of our most distinguished former SRSGs as well. I just want to add a couple of points, but start very much with our thanks from DPO for the outstanding report that you guys have written, and thanks for consulting us as well throughout the process. We had lots of lively exchanges about the draft, but also the events that you organized in connection with this report were extremely useful for us. And we'll think about how to turn some of what is in the report into guidance internally, even though someone said earlier that more guidance is not necessarily the solution. But I think there is a need to reflect some of the key lessons that you've drawn from the case studies much more strongly in what we do internally in terms of training and guidance. And I'll just highlight three that I think are particularly salient. One is the very mixed role that peace agreements often play. I think we still are often stuck worshipping at the altar of peace agreements that are deeply flawed, may not be actually the right tools anymore to pursue political settlements and solutions in that particular country. And we, of course, are often excluded from the negotiations of the peace agreements to a degree that makes their implementation even more problematic from a peacekeeping perspective, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's important that you highlighted that as one of the very first lessons. That also relates to the very crucial role of local peace processes, which several speakers have alluded to, which translates to a different conceptualization of who within our missions actually implements political strategies. And the emphasis on civil affairs, human rights officers, et cetera, all playing a very, very important role in supporting the local political processes is important, which links to a point I think made in one of the other meetings on this report, that we shouldn't call them political strategies necessarily, since then only political affairs thinks they have to implement them. The mission strategies themselves have to be political tools and clearly articulate the political objectives and bring everybody behind those objectives, including, of course, our military components, UN's colleagues, etc. The third point I wanted to emphasize maybe, or reinforce that Amira and Karen and others made, is the very last lesson, the one related to peace dividends. And I would expand that a bit, not just call it peace dividends, but refer more to the core governance problems that bedevil many of these countries, and that if left unaddressed will lead to relapses, coups, other things that are happening, unfortunately, in many or most of our mission countries far too often. And the point Karen made about the equitable provision of essential services to the population, and I think you quoted someone in Liberia you spoke to, is incredibly important in that context, and something our missions know, but often don't feel particularly empowered to really address. Of course, we've been talking for a couple of decades about having to work closer with the bank and IMF and UNDP and others on those issues, but I still think that we're nowhere near being able to address those core governance and social service issues satisfactorily in a way that actually links to the political strategy as well. Lastly, just to clarify one point that was mentioned a couple of times, the guidance that's under development on mission concepts doesn't represent a shift. It simply reflects a previous policy that was written that does provide for a strong HQ role in the articulation of mission concepts. This was intended to align it with the military CONOPS and the police CONOPS, which, as Patrick knows, are headquarters documents. And there's always this anomaly that you had a headquarters military CONOPS and then the mission strategy was at the mission level. And resolving those tensions and inconsistencies is something that we're currently tackling. David Harry and Francois Vignon are co-chairing a new group that was just established in follow-up to a note done by OPSP. I won't bore you with all the internal details, but it is part and parcel of the bigger discussion we're having right now to sort out some long-standing planning problems. Lastly, and Adam knows that I have an issue with this, I don't think personally that we should adopt a definition of political solutions. Number one, definitions are dangerous business in the UN, as you know. And secondly, it creates this impression that there's one solution. There isn't one solution. Even the most comprehensive peace agreement is just one milestone in an ongoing political process. It's a constant process of renegotiation, contestation, etc. And therefore the political primacy and the core role of the political strategies and process remains throughout. There isn't one point where you reach a solution and then you can wash your hands and move on. So I don't necessarily think that that's a good starting point. Everything else in the report is great. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Oliver, and for being really an advisor on this project from the beginning. It's been really helpful. And I think on the definition, our thought was to have kind of a working one for the paper, but we certainly aren't pushing for one into the policy world of the UN yet, though we might try. So, but I think one of the points that you make, that there's this maybe a tension. There's this idea that peacekeeping operations should be participating in the kind of broader socioeconomic fabric of countries. And many of our speakers have pointed to the kind of political economy lens and the need to think more broadly about socioeconomic factors. But then the other side is that peacekeeping missions keep getting more and more ambitious mandates with more and more things to do. And we want to try and maybe slim them down and make them more realistic. And I think it'd be interesting to think, how do you square those two points? And is there a way to do it? Time flies when you're talking about peacekeeping, and we are now into our kind of wrapping up part, where we're going to give each of the speakers a couple minutes to say anything that they didn't have a chance to. And we'll start that with Patrick. We'll do Patrick, Amira, Karen, and then Tori will close us up, and I will meanwhile put Daniela Kroslak's written response into the chat so that everybody can read it. Over to you, Patrick.
Thanks, Adam. Very briefly, I would like to say a few more words on the relation between the SRG and the force commander. Very interesting to see that many times you see force commanders for the first time operating in a UN environment and coming from a NATO or European Union background, and are extremely surprised that there is a civilian leadership, there is the logistics are in civilian hands, and there you have the first moments that things are going off the rails in the relation between the force commander, the civilian colleagues, and the SRG. And I think a few years back we have started a force commanders mentoring course, which had something to do with that as well. And over the years, unfortunately, you saw that ebbing away. And now you see force commanders who are simply not sufficiently prepared for where they are going, in particular in relation to how do you work with the force commander, with the SRG, how do you work with your DNS and your deputy SRG. So I think we should invest more in preparing the military and police component leaders when they are deploying. Second is that what Oliver said, on the political solution. Yes, but there's one thing for sure: for all those problems is not a military solution, and that is something that we really have to put with the force commander when he is deploying. Don't try to get a military solution. You have to work with your SRG to make sure that you can fulfill the wishes, the political wishes, and see with your threat assessment and your risk analysis, you can do that with the force, yes or no. But ensure a secure environment so that all the others can do their work. That is the primary role of the military in a peacekeeping operation. Thanks, Adam.
Thank you, Patrick. That's really really interesting to hear. I'm now going to turn to Amira in case she has any final thoughts.
Just one thought, really, that we are working in an environment where there's the huge assault on multilateralism. We're working also in an environment where resources in terms of the post-COVID environment are going to be stretched for the kinds of things that we're talking about in terms of peace dividends and other things that the United Nations can bring to bear on any one of these nations. And therefore, I think that this kind of aligning behind one strategy. And the point is that a political strategy doesn't mean supremacy of one area over another. And I think you've talked about the primus inter pares. But it is, it is very important that the alignment is there. And the only thing that I would urge, even in these areas of resource constraints, is that the training and the nurturing that Patrick just mentioned in terms of force commanders, but I think this needs to happen across the board in terms of leadership. How do we bring it together? Because now more than ever, we have to prove that we can do it and that that it's viable. So what is it that we're trying to achieve, and how can we do it and prepare those the smaller missions on the ground to be able to do that? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amira. Turning straight to Karen.
Thanks, Adam. Just one point, and that is, I think we have heard, without coming back to it very often, a lot of support for the HIPPO proposal of two-stage mandating, an initial mandate with an overall political goal. And I think it's now important to nail down the process that would give us two-stage mandating. And given what's been said today, that in that first stage, those economic and social actors also take part. Of course, it doesn't mean that those elements are going to be part and parcel of what the mission does, but they should be part and parcel of what the UN country team as a whole agrees to focus on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. I like the kind of practical SRSG approach of what can we do next also, which is something that we always struggle with in the policy report writing, but it's great food for thought. I'm now going to turn over to Tori for any final remarks you have. Go ahead, Tori. Oh, before I do, just to say that obviously we weren't able to cover everything in our reports. This is really meant as a teaser. We will hopefully have future events where we can talk about this kind of thing. But please do contact us if you have thoughts and ideas that are prompted by this.
I see that Adam may have some technical difficulties. So let me just move to our wrap up, and then I can invite him to give a final comment if that's useful. First of all, huge thanks to our panelists, to Karen, Amira, Patrick Merritt, and others. Each of you has said some really important things. I mean, Patrick, thank you for reminding me, all us, the alignment between military ends towards political solutions. And Amira, I'll come back to you later about your transitions question, but it's a good challenge for all of us to think about how political strategies in the beginning should align with the mission successfully completing its job, and what does that look like? And Karen, your point about the trends, I think this is also what Amira was just facing. We're in a very different moment than we were when most of these missions we studied were launched. Political challenges then are very different today, not just because of council dynamics, but a trends in the kinds of conflicts we're seeing, great power competition as well, and basically the trust deficit, which was mentioned earlier. I think for our purposes here, we hope we're kicking off a conversation. All of us who worked on this report, I want to congratulate Adam and Aditi and Charlie for their excellent work and their deep case studies. We're interested both in the strategic moment, but also in the specifics of how we move forward. I think each of us is very practical. So in addition to the two-step process, I think we also want to look at better alignment of political and protection of civilians mandates and how they can actually play off each other and not be seen as either in competition or in hindrance with one another. We also want to look at the phases of not just of missions, but of the political ways to support missions to do more with what they have. And if there are greater tools that they could be embedded with outside the council. It's been mentioned that sometimes the politics are outside the council. What does an SRSG and his or her team need to actually succeed in the field? And what are warning signs when that's not going well? And then lastly, for all of us, I think the SPMs and the other missions are fruit for potential future consideration and something we might consider. But just to echo what Adam said, we welcome comments and thoughts. We're hoping to kick off a conversation. And I also want to thank you and Adam for their work and the government of the Netherlands. I think that's it from me, Adam.